Hello, I'm Emma Ashford, a senior fellow in the Reimagining US Grand Strategy Program at the Stimson Center. Welcome to the Strategy Sessions, a series of discussions with forward-looking out-of-the-box thinkers on the future of US foreign policy. Joining me today, virtually, is Mike Brenes, the director of the Brady Johnson Program on Grand Strategy and a lecturer in history at Yale University. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks for having me.
So before we get started on your essay, I want to talk a little about some general questions. And I think one of the most important is understanding the world for which we're trying to craft a strategy. There's been a lot of debate. Is it multipolar, bipolar? What will be the role of the US, the role of China? And so I'm curious, what is your mental model of the world that we're entering in the next few decades?
I do think that the world is increasingly multipolar. I think that is the present and the future for the United States and for China and the rest of the world. I think you see that on multiple areas, on multiple fronts. Certainly economically, we are increasing in a multipolar world with the rise of China over the past 20 years, China controlling many aspects of economic production, global manufacturing, green climate technology, green technology, India being poised to be the third largest economy in the world by 2030. These factors indicate to me that economically the world is increasingly multipolar and will be so. I think also what we're going to see, particularly with issues like climate change and with strategic minerals, that the global south, countries in Asia and Africa outside of India, those countries in Africa and Asia that aren't great powers or rising powers will also have increasingly a greater share or role to play in international relations. Particularly, I think given the ways that strategic minerals has been an interest of the past 5-10 years, and also because what climate change will do to shape the dynamics of various countries and what that will do to potentially shape regional migration and then international migration. And I think that means that the United States, for instance, a country that I've studied a lot and most concerned about in my research, that is going to mean that the United States, its influence is going to, I think, wane. And it's not that the United States as a superpower is going to, that it's going to disappear, its superpower status is going to disappear, or that it's going to be in a position where it's not going to have a preeminent role in economic and military affairs, far from it. But I think the ability for the United States to achieve the outcomes it wants to achieve, militarily, economically, strategically, will be few and far between, to be quite blunt. I don't think the United States is going to be able to use its military power and economic power to achieve the same ends that it did, certainly during the unipolar moment, but even during the Cold War. And I think that is an interesting situation to be in. It's a new world for us all. Certainly, for people like us who grew up in the unipolar moment, right, who saw U.S. foreign policy develop as it did during the unipolar moment, but even those who were educated by the Cold War. This is not a new Cold War. It's not a great power competition, in my view, that will lead to one country dominating over the other. It's a multipolar world, and I think that the United States, for the reasons I just articulated and specified, should be willing to accommodate that world rather than resist it. And I'll just put a final point, and I think China as well. And I think all countries should be trying to understand and accommodate this multipolar world as opposed to trying to dominate or try to control aspects of economic power in the ways that we saw during the polar era, certainly during the Cold War.
So I think that's the next logical question, right? I mean, if you were to design American foreign policy for this new world, what would your guiding principles be? And it sounds like accommodation might be one of them. But I'm curious, what would you prioritize? Perhaps that's a poor choice of words in grand strategic debates, but where
Right.
should the US focus?
I think that's an excellent question, and it's an excellent point, which is that the United States, in my view, has not prioritized its interests and has not prioritized its goals or its ends, really since the end of the Cold War. The United States has pursued a variety of different ends and has not been specific about what it wants to achieve in the world. And what it has sought to achieve during the War on Terror, extirpating terrorism from the face of the globe, trying to be the security force or the world's policeman, those ends, if that was what the War on Terror was supposed to achieve, obviously failed. And I think we're now in a position where, because the world is increasingly multipolar, the ends are not infinite, but they're multiple. You could see the United States prioritizing control over the South China Sea. Well, you could see the United States prioritizing security issues in various regions of the world. For my interest, I think the United States should be focusing on areas of transnational concern and the areas that I believe that of concern that are existential threats to the United States and China, its rivals, China and Russia, but also the rest of the world. And that is climate change. There's pandemics. That is issues like inequality. That is issues like refugee and migration crises, which exacerbate xenophobia and nationalism, and that contributed to a lot of the democratic crises or crises of democracy or liberalism that we see in the world today. And I think the problem of the United States, the problem that the United States confronts right now in terms of its thinking about U.S. foreign policy, is that it's stuck in a paradigm of competition. It's stuck in a paradigm of, like, if we're not great power competition, then it's essentially a race between the United States and the rest of the world, as we see during the Trump administration, to have U.S. dominate, whether that be tariffs, when we're talking about EU policy, or whether that mean dominate in the South China Sea militarily. And that's just not going to, again, as I said earlier, achieve the ends that the United States wants to achieve, and also will be counterproductive. The rest of the world doesn't want that. The rest of the world, I think, wants a more cooperative, if not multilateral, international approach to world affairs, particularly dealing with issues like climate, like pandemics, like debt relief in global South. And I think the United States has an ability to think long term. We'll see what happens with the Trump administration, but the United States, after Trump, certainly has an ability, opportunity to think long term about where it goes in the direction of tackling transnational issues, existential issues like climate. Given that, again, its interests aren't going to be met, I think, as we're currently pursuing them, and that the United States influence is not going to be significant or as significant as it once was on the international stage.
I think that's a good place to pivot into your essay. And it's actually funny. Almost none of the other contributors in this project talk much about Donald Trump at all. But if there's a central figure in foreign policy debates today, love him or hate him, it's Donald Trump.
Yes.
You make the point in your essay that he's not persuadable. You basically say the foreign policy community is irrelevant for the next 4 years. So, are you basically saying that, strategy has to focus on, the day after, that we have this sort of 3-year interregnum and, it's about planning for after Trump?
Partly. I think the point I was trying to make in the essay is that the foreign policy commentariat, national security policy circles, people who are in the Biden administration, they won't have an influence on Donald Trump. And Trump is going to do what he's going to do. And I think, but Trump really is concerned about two issues and two issues alone, which is tariffs and immigration. Trump really sees threats to national security from within. And in particular, he sees the threat to be undocumented immigrants and of course, a host of xenophobic and racist and sometimes paranoid arguments come out about the threat that undocumented immigrants pose to American security interests. But outside of those two issues, he really doesn't have a core. He really doesn't have a set of values. I think he's transactional, obviously, as we've already talked about in other spaces. But he also just really just going to go with the wind. He's going to maneuver as he sees a new issue be popular or sees that something is going to be significant to boost his image or his popularity. But I think the damage that will be done is already kind of forecasted in the past 6 months, is that Trump is just going to be a chaotic force. And I think we are living in an age, or will be living in an age of Trump, which is to say we're living in an age of nationalism and xenophobia that Trump will leave an indelible mark on. And I think the question then for me, and this is to your point about our question about what comes after, I think is how do you deal with this age of nationalism that not just the United States is confronting, but countries in Europe, of course, are dealing with it, and it's even in Asia as well. If you look at India and Modi, I think then the answer for me is internationalism is the cure to nationalism, like multilateralism is the cure to nationalism, because nationalism gets us more Donald Trumps. So what can be the antidote? What can be a tonic cure for what ails us? And I think thinking anew about what internationalism means after Donald Trump is important. And I think, and I'll end with this point, I think that we should treat the post-Trump moment as a post-war moment, where after World War II or after the Cold War, the United States took stock of its institutions and took stock of its role in the world. The taking stock in World War II led to international institutions being created. There was a different result after the end of the Cold War, of course, because it was a different moment. But I think that's how we should treat Donald Trump, that he will leave a mark on American foreign policy for quite some time. It's not a mark that I want to see last very long. And then those who don't want to see that mark last, then I think it's incumbent upon us to come up with a better vision for U.S. foreign policy. And I think that is an internationalist one that can move us out of the years of Donald Trump and what he's done to shape foreign policy.
So let's stick with the domestic lens for a moment, because I think one of the most obvious areas where this administration is going to impact and shape foreign policy is the destruction of existing institutions of US soft power. We've seen the USAID closed down. We've seen various government-associated think tank institutions, the Wilson Center, USIP closed, State Department reorganization. And so I think, one problem for your vision is that, it may be more difficult to do US foreign policy, to engage multilaterally in a post-Trump administration. How do you think about rebuilding or thinking about new domestic institutions?
I think it's a great question. I think ultimately the United States has to come to again, grips with the fact that Donald Trump profits off of insecurity, and he profits off of anxiety, and he profits off of people who feel like there is no hope other than making sure that they feel better than their enemy. I think Donald Trump has used tactics of fear to elevate himself and shape our politics. And I think that's in one sense, sort of a psychological problem, but I think we have to deal with it in materialist terms. Right? The United States is in a position where, as you say, after Trump, institutions of social welfare or domestic institutions will be hollowed out. And I think there are voices out there within the Democratic Party and outside the Democratic Party who are saying, look, Trump's in it, and the Democratic Party, I think, is in a position where it can be a bulwark against Donald Trump, but you have to offer a better version of liberalism. You have to offer a better vision of tomorrow than what Donald Trump has. And so far, the Democrats have not offered that. The status quo has been the status quo, the same. And so I think first it comes with the Democratic Party or opponents of Trump building a vision of a more affirmative vision of government, of what government can be, creating political coalitions that can mobilize people along these lines. And then once you're in power, then I think then the institution building is easier. I mean, I think this is what we've seen with Donald Trump, is that he's been able to capture essentially all three branches of government and use his power in ways to dismantle agencies. Now, I think ultimately my vision would be that those who are opposed to Donald Trump and his vision of austerity and just canceling programs because he feels that they're not interested in the best interest of the United States, or they're serving the purposes of DEI, whatever that may be, that we can offer political coalitions of us can offer a better vision, and then get elected and use the three branches of government in ways that we haven't been able to for quite some time. But I think you're right. It's going to be a 10, 20-year process. This is not, and this is to your point earlier about Donald Trump and shaping foreign policy. He's irrevocably shaped, I think, domestic policy as well. He's a key figure in our history now. And so the rebuilding process, and this is where grand strategy comes in, will be 10 to 20 years. But I think it's also a project that is simultaneous with foreign policy. A better domestic policy creates a better foreign policy, and the two reinforce each other. And I think that's something that I would like to see go forward for, from the Democratic Party or for people who are opposed to Trump, is sort of linking domestic and foreign policy together in ways that they have not been, and try to, again, offer better vision to the American public about what foreign policy can be, what many Americans are opposed to forever wars, or been opposed to endless wars, don't like to see their money's being wasted abroad, and then also want to see their money's being put to good use at home, and want to see that government is a force of good. Many Americans like Social Security, they like Medicare, they like SNAP, they like environmental regulations. And I think linking those two things in together in ways that are coherent and drive people to the ballot box, and therefore create institutions once those people get elected to power. I think that's the vision that I have going forward over the next 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, and I think that can be a very tough sell. Foreign policy doesn't typically move votes. Much of the country's in a very nationalist mood. So, I mean, I think your approach is broadly within the progressive camp in terms of that linkage of domestic politics and foreign policy, in terms of centering values, maybe not the way that they've been centered over the last couple of decades, but talking about things like justice or accountability and the multilateral system as ways to achieve that. I guess, I would like you to talk a little bit more about that, and also about, how the United States might actually be able to achieve some of these things, because it seems to me that we've spent a lot of the unipolar moment trying to use US power to push various kinds of values with relatively minimal success. And so, could we just talk for a few minutes about values and how we actually pursue them?
No, I think that's absolutely correct. The values of the United States in the unipolar moment, and the values of the United States during this era of competition, have been to make sure that the U.S. is up and the rest of the world is down. Where how do you serve U.S. interests? You abide by U.S. power. That's basically been, from my perspective, maybe I'm being too harsh. From my perspective, that's been the approach the United States has taken. And so what that's done, I think, over the past 20, 25 years, is that it's eroded the power of the multilateral international institutions that we have, that would provide justice or accountability to the United States, yes, but also to other countries as well. And I think we see this in the case of the International Criminal Court, the ICJ, when the United States just says the ICJ doesn't matter as it relates to Israel, or relates to concerns that it has or allies. I think the ICJ doesn't matter when the United States is, feels that its interests are so, or the United States, or the United Nations doesn't matter, right? If it's just a situation where we can just ignore, and that case is very, very effective at ignoring the United Nations for the past 25 years. And so trying to, and succeeding in ignoring the concerns of the international community, and yet at the same time trying to say, well, the United States represents freedom and democracy in the world, has gotten us nowhere. It's gotten us, actually, much of the world angry at us for failing to adhere to our values. I think first and foremost, then, beyond the points I've made about creating institutions or building upon partnerships and alliances that the United States has to include new allies, or to include China on certain endeavors, I think the United States should first recognize our values in these international institutions that exist. Why does the United States just decide to ignore the WTO when it suits their interests in terms of tariffs? But yet we yell at China for when it ignores the WTO, right? Like, why do we do that? And I think this just goes back to sort of cold realism in many ways. Well, great powers act in the interest of great powers, but the United States, as it has been told to us for centuries, is an exceptional nation. We have the ability to spread democracy and should be. We can argue about that, but for many people in the security establishment, should be spreading democratic values, at least in some capacity, not through nation building, but through some soft power. And it's hard to do that if you're just ignoring the rest of the world. And I would say the rest of the world, certainly the global South on this matter. And again, we can isolate Gaza and the situation in Gaza as a key indication of how the United States has alienated the rest of the world by not adhering to its values and not adhering to the world's values. When the rest of the world is saying a situation like Gaza demands greater attention and demands something needs to be done to stop what Israel is doing, and the United States says no, then it's just hard and near impossible for the United States to try to continue encouraging the rest of the world to buy into its mission. And I think that's the first step to rectifying things, and then going from there. We'll see if that happens, but again, in a post-Trump world, I think the opportunities can be multiple.
So I think a common criticism of this kind of progressive approach or this kind of multilateralist approach is that it's easy to talk about the places where the United States has failed to live up to its values or to, abide by the rules that it's agreed to. But it's also the case that China, Russia, others regularly violate these rules as well. And it's not clear how, the US compels them to abide by these rules. Is it possible in an era of great power competition to have this kind of multilateralism? And you may well reject the notion that we're in an era of great power competition. But, I'm curious how you see this working.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that I do reject it. We are in an era of great power competition. I don't think that's what we're in. I think great power competition is a policy choice. It's a framework that is a policy choice, but it's certainly not a strategy. It's certainly not a vision for how to get to or achieve certain ends. Competition, I would argue, is just that. It's trying to compete with a rival for power, status, influence, but it doesn't actually spell out what the ends are. And I think the first thing, is to reject the idea that competition achieves the ends that the United States wants for itself, because it hasn't. What has great power competition bestowed us over the past 10 years? Well, close to 10 years. We've tried to constrain China, constrain its economic influence, constrain its developments in technology, constrain its developments in climate. Currently, China is, developing new, cheaper, with DeepSeek models, AI models. It's controlling 75%, I think, is the current figure of climate technology and new technology coming out of China. China controls electric vehicle production. It's in a situation where it's simply dominating the United States and will be the country that can lead us into climate change. So great power competition, if you want to just take stock of it, has not achieved the ends that we wanted it to achieve. And therefore it's unproductive and counterproductive to achieve the United States interests. I think that's the first step to admitting that it's not working and to move into a more you can call it progressive or cooperative approach to foreign policy. But I think that's key. And my hope is that when Trump is done with his chaotic transactional approach to U.S. foreign policy, and we realize that, we're in perhaps even further behind China on many things, that we're just not structurally, we're just not in a position to catch up. And I think that's what's going to happen, is that the United States is going to be forced to reckon with the fact that it can't, because it can't actually win on the fronts that it says it should be winning on. And I think that ideological plus structural reality will come to the fore for the next for, I believe, over the next 4 to 8 years, 10 years. And the United States will be forced to adapt a new position. So I think partly, I mean, hopefully it's a choice. It's a proactive choice that the United States foreign policy establishment can make. But I think it's going to be one that's going to be forced upon them, regardless of whether they want to make it or not. Because I don't think China is on the verge of collapse at the moment. China's, the 7 to 8% growth rates that it had are not here, but 5 to 6%, I think, will be here to stay over the next few years. The regime of Xi Jinping doesn't look like it's collapsing anytime soon. I don't think you're going to be in a position where the United States can ignore China. And that's to end on this point. I think that's the driver into a more cooperative stance, is that the United States is in a multipolar world where, again, it can't have the influence it once had, is in a position where it's going to have to accommodate China's rise as opposed to resist it. And you can call that progressive, and you can call that cooperative strategy, but in the end, I think that's the reality. And coming to terms with that and trying to achieve multilateralism or multilateralism as possible, I think that's the first step to a more a better foreign policy that considers accountability and justice. That sort of builds upon a cooperative stance, and that is difficult, I think, but it's something that we can think about achieving again long term.
I appreciate the honesty, to be honest. I think a lot of people would argue that that the US having a more cooperative approach does not necessarily mean accepting US decline, or does not necessarily mean that China is going to be calling at least some of the shots in the world. I mean, is there a version of your vision that doesn't involve US sort of decline, or is this something you see as sort of baked in and we kind of have to adapt to it?
So I see the U.S. decline at more, again, in terms of the outcomes. I don't see, again, the United States in a position where it's not one or two economically. Certainly one military, like number position militarily. I think retrenchment is not forthcoming. It's very unpopular. It's hard to achieve in American history. And we're getting a $1 trillion defense budget soon. So that's not a sign of retrenchment, as much as Trump has talked about cutting the military, or Hegseth has talked about cutting the military. That's not going to happen. So I think it's more, again, in a multipolar world with the economic and material outcomes that the United States wants to achieve can't be achieved. I think that's going to, again, shape its diplomacy and its diplomatic outcomes and its diplomatic approach to world affairs. But that's not a position of decline structurally, in the sense of like the United States no longer being a superpower. I think that that's, to me, maybe it's a distinction without a difference, but I think that to me is a clear indication that the United States, its policy of primacy has to be rethought. Right? If primacy is not going through competition or through dominance during the unipolar moment, if primacy is not achieving the ends for American foreign policy, then something, again, must be done differently. The U.S. must accommodate a new world where primacy doesn't work. And I think that's where I'm stepping into the conversation, is to say, I think ultimately primacy is counterproductive again for the United States, but it's going to be hard to sort of make a convincing argument to U.S. foreign policymakers and to the public to sort of just give up primacy for the sake of giving up primacy. What I would say is we have to accommodate the world and remake primacy to suit certain ends, right? And I think those ends are ones that we saw in the wake of World War II. The United States was a preeminent superpower alongside the Soviet Union, but we recognized the Soviet Union was not going to go away. We recognized what George Kennan but famously articulated in 1946, that there was going to be a long, drawn-out contest over control of the world. And I think we should recognize China and realizing that we can't have a contest as we did between the United States and Soviet Union, because it's not a new Cold War. We can't have a bipolar competition, but recognizing that China is here to stay, and that we have, actually, because of our integrated economies, we have a clear interest in sustaining the other, actually supporting Chinese consumerism, and the United States and China supporting American consumerism in ways. I think that's what's the reality. And I think that means that primacy can be remade. It can be retooled to accommodate this multipolar order. And I think that's a convincing argument for people in the Democratic Party who want to, who come to progressive foreign policy activists and say, "Oh, you just want us to cut the military budget." Yeah, we would like that, but in the end, I don't think that's the first step we should be thinking about. I think we should be thinking about retooling primacy to pursue this multipolar order, and then when stability is achieved and when results are materialized, I think in the way that they do, then I think cutting the defense budget on certain aspects and together, I think, is the retrenchment on a broader scale in a new era. I think that's something to be talked about in a more serious and programmatic way, if that makes sense. And this is sort of maybe as a reflection of where I'm at, which is that I'm recognizing that we're in a moment of where competition reigns, and I think getting out of that as fast as possible will suit the United States and the American people to a large degree.
Well, we are running out of time here, but before we wrap up, I do want to ask you the one final question we're asking everybody, which is, we at the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program, we're all about questioning assumptions. And so, what is your top assumption about U.S. foreign policy that you think should be challenged?
I think it speaks to the last comment I made, which is that the United States cannot achieve the ends it wants to achieve through primacy. That we cannot we can't dominate the world. We can't facilitate conditions where China collapses in ways that suit our interests. So that competition, for the sake of competition, or to force China to capitulate to American interests, just won't happen. And I asked the question that many foreign policy experts have asked, which is like, what does the fall of China to U.S. interests look like? Do we want the Xi Jinping regime to collapse? Do we want the CCP to collapse? Do we want the Chinese economy to collapse? Do we want to basically have China just sort of fall on the American sword and say, tell us what we can do for you? I just don't see any of those outcomes being the best interests of the United States, Chinese, or the world, again, for that matter, given the ways that the Chinese economy influences world outcomes, and certainly the United States too. So the idea that we can win the competition is just not possible. Primacy is not going to work. We think U.S. foreign policy along more positive lines. I think that's too ambitious again, but but that's my main assumption.
No, I like that one. The assumption that the US can win great power competition against China. We'll have to call on historians like yourself in several decades to see if that one's true or false. So that's all we have time for. I really appreciate you joining me today. So thank you.
Oh, thanks, Emma. It was a great pleasure and great to see you.